Today on InGrace, we're in Jerusalem, and we're going to talk to award-winning author Joel Rosenberg. Ever since I was a boy, I've been fascinated with God's creation. I'm traveling the planet to tell His story about His world. I'm Jim Scudder Jr. Come with me on another exciting adventure in grace. Welcome to InGrace. I'm Jim Scudder Jr., and today we're in Jerusalem to talk to Joel Rosenberg. Joel's books have sold by the millions. He has written nonfiction and fiction. Of course, many of you have read Joel's books. I really enjoyed his last one, Enemies and Allies. And I wanted to sit down and talk to him about the issues surrounding the peace of this land, the peace of Jerusalem, the peace of Israel, the hatred of many in the world against Jewish people, to try to help understand why that is, and also to talk about the incredible Abraham Accords and the amazing delegation trips that he has made with evangelical leaders, with some Muslim countries. And so I think today's InGrace is going to really bless you as you hear more about these important topics. Hey, it's great to have you on InGrace today, Joel. And I've enjoyed your book, Enemies and Allies. Well, let me rephrase that. I didn't enjoy the first part.
Okay, the enemies part.
I was literally scared half to death.
Yeah.
With the axis of the three countries that seem to be coalescing against Israel and, of course, against America.
Yeah. Well, Jim, great to be with you, and welcome back to Israel, particularly to Jerusalem, the epicenter of the epicenter of the epicenter. Huh. Look, 20 years after 9/11, I wrote Enemies and Allies because our enemies are very different today than the way we thought of them 20 years ago. 20 years ago, Al-Qaeda was the main threat and set us into motion into 2 decades of war in the Middle East. Yes, against 2 nation states, the Taliban government in Afghanistan and the terrorist network that was sort of permeated throughout Afghanistan. And then, of course, to remove Saddam Hussein from power and then dealing with all the terrorist forces and Iranian proxy forces in Iraq. But most of our fighting over the last 20 years has been against non-state actors. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that difficult to bring down the Taliban government or the Saddam government. But all the terrorists and proxy militia forces, that was extraordinarily different. And we had the rise of ISIS, the Islamic State, genocide against Christians. I mean, it's been a brutal, horrific 20 years here in the Middle East. But that is mostly changed, right? And as I describe in Enemies and Allies, from interviewing, the key leaders that were involved in this, Secretary of State then Mike Pompeo, President Trump, whose policies brought down the ISIS caliphate, ended the genocide against Christians. Not alone. Obviously, the United States worked with our Kurdish and Arab allies and so forth. But we don't think of Al-Qaeda as the main serious threat. It's still a threat. Mm-hmm. ISIS is still there, but it's not a major strategic threat like it was. Iran. Iran, not the people, but the government. This is the single biggest threat in the region, made worse, as you alluded to, as I described in the book, because Iran, in its inability so far to build nuclear warheads, has decided to build out alliances with very serious, dangerous actors. Vladimir Putin in Russia, Recep Erdogan in Turkey, and then you add the Chinese and the North Koreans, and suddenly the Iranian regime, horrible on its own right, wanting to annihilate, wipe out Israel, is forming this broader alliance with very dangerous players. And most Americans, I don't think, have thought about who are our enemies in this region today, and thought it through carefully. And that's what the first part of the book is trying to do.
Erdogan's changing, and certainly is militant.
Erdogan is playing both sides. He's trying to claim to remain a NATO ally, and yet every move he's making, or nearly every move, is moving Turkey from a moderate, friendly, pro-Western, pro-American ally to the dark side, to an alliance with Russia, with Iran, and with other dangerous actors to the east. So Turkey had been the model of a moderate Muslim government, a moderate Muslim nation.
The first part of the book was about the enemies, and that's scary. But the heartwarming part of the book was to see what has transpired not just about a year ago, the Abraham Accords. And you had a front row seat, and I will even suggest a part in kind of some of the things that transpired. You're modest and you probably wouldn't say that, but I see it as all of your delegation trips with evangelical leaders, unprecedented trips to a number of moderate Muslim nations, has led to something unbelievable. And that is a peace agreements with a number of countries and perhaps more to come.
Well, I don't take any credit. I don't think we played an element in these things happening. But you're right. We did get a front row seat. We also got a backstage pass in these things happening. And in a sense, that the fact that Arab kings and crown princes, presidents and prime ministers throughout this region decided to invite me, an American, Israeli, Jewish, evangelical Zionist with two sons who've served in the Israeli army. Why would the Saudi leadership invite me? They've never invited Christian leaders into the palace in 300 years, they told me, but they asked me to bring a delegation. The United Arab Emirates has never invited Christian leaders into the palace. No delegation like this, an evangelical delegation, in the entire history of the country. And they asked me why, and the other countries too. So I think that while we didn't play a factor in bringing peace, the fact that they wanted to talk about peace with us and human rights and religious freedom and the threat from Iran and the threat from radical Islamism, and then, as we said, as peace with Israel was a bit of evidence before the Abraham Accords happened that attitudes were changing, okay? Going back just for a moment into the Oval Office conversation I had with President Trump, that too was prior to the Abraham Accords coming to pass. But what I said to him, I said, my criticisms and concerns about you, I don't know, withstanding maybe, I'm stunned by how much you've gotten done. You did move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, fulfilling a law that was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in Congress in 1995. Okay, this wasn't some new, let's just do something. Every American president, Democrat and Republican, for 20 years was saying they would do it. They didn't do it. 25 years. Trump did it. He also recognized that Israel has sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He just declared that Jerusalem is Israel's capital. He offered a peace treaty to the Palestinians. Israelis said yes. The Palestinians wouldn't even discuss it. And then came 4 Arab-Israeli peace agreements in which everybody in what I call the peace industry in Washington, all the experts, all the former senior officials who are absolutely certain they know how to make peace between Israel and the Arab world, and even though they've never done it, they said Trump's a moron, he's a novice, he has no experience. Not only will he not make peace between Israel and the Arab world, he'll make things worse. And I quote in the book person after person after person. You can see the direct quotes. Famously, I guess, former Secretary of State John Kerry, he goes, I know how this is done. I've had 300 calls and conversations with Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. I know, and I'm telling you that people are out there saying that if you just set the Palestinian leadership aside and you just focus on Israel and the Arab world, that you can actually make peace. I'm telling you, no. He said it 4 times. Yes. And what do we have? 4 Arab-Israeli peace agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Those are Arab countries. But there's a 5th, that's Kosovo, a Muslim majority country, not Arab ethnically, but Muslim majority, that also normalized relations with it. This is huge. And it's kind of crazy that if there is such thing as a Nobel Peace Prize, you can't win for making 4 or 5 Muslim-Israeli peace and normalization agreements. I mean, that just devalues the concept. But it happened.
Yes.
And it happened under the leadership of a president that, was taking incoming fire, even from his friends, and sometimes rightly so, for the tweets and the comments.
Sure.
This is big. And it is, and so in the book, I describe, this is the only book so far, Enemies and Allies, that takes you inside to show you the inside story of how the Abraham Accords were actually negotiated, how they happened, why they happened, why now. With the United States moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, this was the single biggest thing that the peace industry said. There'll never be peace in this region because you've just lit a match and thrown it onto a pile of gas-soaked logs. Like, that thing's gonna blow up. It didn't. The exact opposite. We didn't have riots here. There weren't riots in the Arab Muslim world. We got 4 peace treaties out of it. 5 if you count the Kosovo. That's huge. How did that happen? And that's the story I tell in the book.
I would love to get into your hands some great creation resources. Irrefutable Creation Evidence is a DVD that features Dr. Carl Baugh's museum in Glen Rose, Texas, and I'll send that to you for a gift of any amount. If your gift is $25 or more, let me send you Dinosaurs That Destroy Evolution. And if your gift is $35 or more, let me also send you Fossil Fishing. And right now, every gift you give to InGrace, more people hear the gospel, and your gift is going to be doubled.
Join InGrace's matching gift campaign. All gifts given this week will be doubled. Call now, 800-78-GRACE, or visit our website at ingrace.tv.
Part of the story is talking about Saudi Arabia, and they have not yet entered into such an agreement, but I feel like you're hopeful, and explain that. Do you think that that could happen?
Yeah. So, again, not only am I the first Christian leader that was invited to bring a delegation to meet the leadership of Saudi Arabia, and not just once, we actually went twice, and I tell both stories in the book. But I'm actually the first and only Israeli citizen that has ever publicly met with the leadership of Saudi Arabia. Now, that's crazy, Jim. That makes no sense.
Yeah.
A Jewish evangelical Israeli, a Messianic Jew, like how does it even happen? Like, it shouldn't happen historically, but it did. Part of our conversations with Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and heir to the throne, and effectively the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, because his father, King Salman, keeping the big picture oversight, but he's really deputized his son to run day-to-day internal and foreign affairs. So this is the player, MBS we call him. In our conversations, a 2-hour conversation the first trip, and then 2 hours with the crown prince on the second trip, and then many more hours with his inner circles. In both conversations, we asked him, are you ready to make peace with Israel, even if the Palestinian leadership is not ready? Now, Jim, keep in mind that the conversations we had, both of them, one in November of 2018, and then the next year in September of 2019, both of those predate the Abraham Accords, right? It wasn't like obvious that the Arab world was going to begin to make peace with Israel. But in both conversations, we said, listen, there's 3 things you need to know about how evangelicals view this situation. Number 1, we love Israel. We love the Jewish people as evangelicals, 600 million evangelicals worldwide. This is a theological position for us. It's not political.
Right.
It has political implications, but it's not political. It's theological. So you can't move us on this. So you just need to know that from us. We don't know what you know about evangelicals, but we want to tell you. So that's one. The second thing is Jesus commands us to love our neighbors. So we don't hate Palestinians. We love the Palestinians. We don't exactly know how to help Israelis and Palestinians find peaceful, prosperous, calm coexistence. That eludes us. We're not here with a plan, but we want you to know that we don't see it as zero sum. We're not here to tell you because we love Israel, we can't stand Palestinians or Muslims or Arabs more generally. But that's important. We conceded to him that, yeah, some evangelicals speak very harshly or in a demeaning way about Palestinians. That's a mistake. It's not the way Christ teaches us to be. But anyway, so we explained that. The third thing we said is we're commanded to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And so that means we've been praying for a long time for peace between Israel and her neighbors. And that's when I said, so we're curious, if the Palestinian leadership is not yet ready to make peace with Israel in the near future, we are praying, who will be the next Arab leader to make peace? Now, we'd had this conversation in the United Arab Emirates with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed. And he had stunned us at this moment, after I'd said those three things, by saying, it's going to be me, Joel. I'm ready. And we're like, what? And he explained to us how he'd come to the decision. In the UAE, we're ready. We believe it's in our national interest to make peace with Israel. And sure enough, 2 years later, the UAE was first to enter the Abraham Accords. So now we're having the exact same conversation with MBS in Saudi Arabia. Now, his answers are off the record. But let's look at the public record. And again, I described this in Enemies and Allies. What can we just see by the public record? Well, number one, when the Abraham Accords happened, Saudi Arabia did not oppose them. Now, when Egypt made peace with Israel in 1979, Saudi Arabia and the entire Arab Muslim world pulled out of Cairo, condemned President Sadat, and pulled the entire Arab League out of Cairo and boycotted Egypt. That was the Saudi and broader Arab reaction to peace in 1979. Today, the Saudis have embraced, encouraged, spoken very positively about the Abraham Accords. That's interesting. Not only did they speak positive, they haven't thrown monkey wrenches into the works behind the scenes. Third, they've allowed Bahraini, Emirati, and Israeli aircraft to fly over Saudi territory, shortening the distances and allowing direct flights for the first time in human history between Israel and the Gulf. They didn't have to do that, but they did. Then, if this were not enough, in December of 2020, Mohammed bin Salman invited Israeli Prime Minister at that time, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the head of our spy agency, Yossi Cohen, the head of Mossad, to visit Saudi Arabia, along with then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, for a secret set of meetings. Wow. Now, of course, the story leaked. Our news agency that I run, All Israel News, was the first to confirm that this was not just rumor. This would actually happen, and I write about it in the book. But you just take those statements or those actions, and you say, clearly the Saudis are moving in a positive direction towards normalization. When and how they make their final decision, I think they will. I actually do believe that the Saudis are going to make peace with Israel, but I don't know when. And I know that every enemy force in the region is trying to dissuade them. And I wrote a novel about this, The Jerusalem Assassin, about a Saudi leader who wants to make peace with Israel. And then all the bad guys come out of the woodwork to try to blow this thing up, a peace summit right here in Jerusalem. So your viewers may find that interesting if they're trying to extrapolate out how this might happen.
Did you ever imagine penning that book where you are today, having been in the presence and influencing all of these leaders?
No, so when I wrote The Last Jihad, which again, as you say, started with this kamikaze attack, this hijacked plane, flying it into an American city. Never been a novel written like that. And then that's the opening chapters. Then it leads to the fictional American president deciding to remove Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq.
Stop. I only read half the book.
Okay,
Joel.
well,
Don't ruin it for me.
That's the trajectory of where we're going. No, when you write your first novel, you just want your mother to be able to find it at a bookstore within 100 miles of her house, right? You can't. It'd be fun to be a bestseller, but you can't base your life on that. And the idea that Middle East monarchs and presidents and their advisors and ambassadors and prime ministers and stuff would read your books, it's 5 million copies sold. No, none of that was foreseeable.
I appreciate your heart for the gospel, to share the most amazing story that there is a God and he loves us. And he proved that by sending Jesus, his son, to die for us.
Right to this city. And he's coming back right to that mountain. I mean, what a great front row seat for it.
I love it. I love it. Thank you.
Jim, great to meet you. Thank you so much.
Okay. I was blessed to hear Joel's story of how he realized that Jesus, Yeshua, is the Messiah. He heard the prophecies fulfilled. He found out that Jesus, the Son of God, came and died for his sins. That's the greatest gift in the entire world. So many people think religion is about being good or not doing bad things, but the Bible says we can never be good enough. We've all sinned. We've all fallen short of the glory of God, but there's hope. And the hope is that God would one day provide a sacrifice that would take away sin, not just cover sin, but take away sin. All of the sacrifices that we read about in the Old Testament were pictures of the perfect ultimate sacrifice. And the Bible tells us that Jesus came and fulfilled the law and the prophets. He kept everything perfectly, yet he died perfect for sin. He died for my sins and for yours. And the evangelical message is simple. If you will, by faith, receive him, put your trust in him, you will be saved today, tomorrow, and forever. I would love to get into your hands some great creation resources. Irrefutable Creation Evidence is a DVD that features Dr. Carl Baugh's museum in Glen Rose, Texas, and I'll send that to you for a gift of any amount. If your gift is $25 or more, let me send you Dinosaurs That Destroy Evolution. And if your gift is $35 or more, let me also send you Fossil Fishing. And right now, every gift you give to InGrace, more people hear the gospel, and your gift is going to be doubled.
Join InGrace's matching gift campaign. All gifts given this week will be doubled. Call now 800-78-GRACE or visit our website at ingrace.tv. Join us next week for a special episode of InGrace entitled Bethlehem's Tower. Record every single InGrace episode. You will be so blessed as we learn all about God's world and God's Word. InGrace is a viewer-supported ministry. Thank you for your prayers and gifts.